CEO Seraphina Blake fired Carter Hayes right there on the factory floor, ordering him off the property within 10 minutes. Carter didn't argue. He just grabbed his old backpack and walked out in silence. But he didn't go home. He turned into the darkest alleys of the city. Something made Seraphina follow him. Her car stopped in front of an abandoned building, and she froze when she saw Carter kneeling down, sharing food and bandaging wounds for a group of homeless children who called him Dad. 3 weeks earlier, Seraphina had signed the contract that would either save her career or destroy it. The board of directors at Blake Dynamics had made their position crystal clear: meet the deadline on the new manufacturing protocol, or step down. Wilfred Stone, the board's most ruthless member, had leaned across the mahogany table and delivered the ultimatum with cold precision. "You're too soft, Seraphina. Soft leaders build soft companies, and soft companies collapse." The warning haunted her because she knew where it came from. Her father had built Blake Dynamics from nothing, but he'd been betrayed by people he trusted, managers who smiled to his face while stealing from the company, workers who exploited his kindness and cut corners that nearly killed someone. Seraphina had watched her father's health deteriorate as the lawsuits piled up. She'd made a vow at his funeral: never trust, never let sentiment cloud judgment, run the company like a machine, because machines don't lie. The factory had been struggling with safety incidents, small things mostly. Oil leaks that shouldn't have happened. Sensor malfunctions that the maintenance team couldn't explain. A worker who'd slipped on hydraulic fluid and broken his wrist. The insurance company was already circling, and Wilfred had made it clear that one more major incident would trigger a full investigation. Seraphina needed scapegoats. She needed discipline. She needed everyone to see that weakness wouldn't be tolerated. Carter Hayes worked the night shift. He rarely spoke to anyone, always took the hardest assignments, never complained. But there were notes in his file. Frequently leaves workstation, takes unauthorized breaks, seen carrying personal items off company property. His supervisor had written him up twice in the past month. Carter always had an explanation, but the explanations were vague. Family emergency. Personal matter. Need to step out for 15 minutes. The backpack was the thing that bothered people most. Carter carried it everywhere, never let it out of his sight. In the break room, workers whispered. Some thought he was stealing tools. Others figured he was dealing drugs. Archie Dunn, the night security guard, had seen Carter sneaking food out of the building several times, but Archie had never reported it. There was something about Carter that didn't fit the profile of a thief. The way he always said thank you. The way he'd help Archie fix the gate latch without being asked. The way he'd once stopped to help an elderly janitor carry a heavy trash bag, even though he was clearly in a hurry. What Seraphina didn't know was that Clinton Voss, her head of operations, had been waiting for the right moment to eliminate Carter. It wasn't personal. It was business. Carter had a habit of noticing things he shouldn't notice. He'd questioned why certain safety sensors were being bypassed to increase production quotas. He'd pushed back when Clinton had ordered the maintenance team to skip inspection protocols to meet deadlines. And Carter had started asking questions about the repair contracts, about why the same subcontractor kept winning bids despite consistently shoddy work. Clinton had a financial arrangement with that subcontractor. Carter was a threat to a very profitable system. The incident happened on a Tuesday night, 48 hours before Seraphina's deadline. The main production line seized up with a metallic scream that echoed through the entire facility. The temperature sensors spiked into the red zone. Someone had silenced the alarm. Carter was the first person to reach the control panel. He could see exactly what was happening. A bearing was overheating. Friction was building. There was hydraulic fluid leaking near an electrical junction. If the line kept running, the whole system could ignite. Carter shouted for an emergency shutdown. Clinton, who was supervising the floor that night, overruled him. "We're behind quota. We can't afford to stop." Carter didn't hesitate. He hit the emergency stop button, the e-stop that killed power to the entire production line. Machinery ground to a halt. Lights flickered. In the sudden silence, everyone could hear the hiss of overheated metal cooling down. The shutdown cost Blake Dynamics $200,000 in lost production. Clinton moved fast. He pulled the sensor logs, edited the timestamps, deleted the sections showing the oil leak and the temperature spike. He kept only the part showing Carter hitting the e-stop. Then he compiled a report and walked it straight to Seraphina's office. "Carter Hayes just sabotaged the production line. We have documentation, and with your deadline coming up, you need to show the board you're in control." Wilfred Stone called Seraphina that same morning. "I'm hearing about another incident. I need to see a head roll, Seraphina, today." She'd been awake for 36 hours straight. The pressure was crushing. She looked at Clinton's report, saw the cost of the shutdown, and made a decision. Seraphina walked onto the factory floor at shift change, when both day and night crews were present. Carter was washing his hands at the industrial sink. She didn't call him to her office. She wanted everyone to see. "Carter Hayes, you caused significant damage to this company's operations. You acted without authorization and cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars. You're terminated. You have 10 minutes to leave the property." The floor went silent. Carter dried his hands slowly. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just looked at Seraphina for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that unsettled her. Not anger. Like he'd expected this. Like he'd been waiting for it. "I need to get my backpack," Carter said quietly. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of urgency she couldn't quite identify. He glanced at the clock on the wall. "May I leave now?" The question was strange. Most people would have argued, demanded an explanation, threatened legal action. Carter just wanted to leave. Immediately, Seraphina nodded, and Carter walked to his locker, grabbed the worn backpack, and headed for the exit. Archie opened the gate for him, and Carter walked into the gray morning without looking back. Seraphina should have felt relief. She'd done what the board demanded. She'd shown strength. But something nagged at her as she watched Carter disappear down the street. The backpack. The way he'd clutched it like it contained something precious. She'd glimpsed inside when he'd opened it at his locker. Bandages, children's medicine, bread, peanut butter, not tools, not stolen property. Archie approached her as she stood by the gate. The old security guard looked uncomfortable. "Miss Blake, I know it's not my place, but Carter Hayes isn't a bad man." Seraphina's jaw tightened. "He cost this company $200,000. Archie nodded slowly. "Maybe. But I've worked here 23 years, and I've never seen someone who. He used to ask me to keep the gate open an extra 30 seconds after his shift. Never told me why. Just always said thank you." The words stuck with Seraphina. She tried to return to her office, tried to focus on the production reports, but her mind kept circling back to Carter. The bandages, the medicine, the bread, the desperate need to leave immediately. She made a decision she couldn't fully explain, even to herself. She got in her car, not the company sedan with the driver, but her personal vehicle. She told herself she was just checking to make sure Carter wasn't stealing anything. But that didn't explain why her hands were shaking on the steering wheel. She spotted him 3 blocks from the factory. Carter was walking fast, head down, backpack pressed against his chest. He stopped at a small corner store, the kind of place that sold expired goods at a discount. Through the window, Seraphina watched him count out coins, buying milk and day-old bread. The store owner, an elderly woman, added extra rolls to his bag without charging him. They clearly knew each other. Carter left the store and turned into a part of the city Seraphina had only seen from the highway. streets with potholes deep enough to swallow a tire, streetlights that flickered or didn't work at all, buildings with boarded windows and graffiti-covered walls. This was where people came when the system had chewed them up and spit them out. Seraphina's corporate instincts screamed at her to turn around, but she kept following. Carter moved through the neighborhood like someone who belonged there, taking shortcuts through alleys, avoiding the main roads. A child, maybe 10 years old, stood at a corner like a lookout. The kid saw Carter and ran ahead, clearly delivering a message. Seraphina parked her car a block away and followed on foot, staying in the shadows. She found him in the skeleton of an abandoned apartment complex, one of those buildings the city had condemned but never demolished. The windows were empty frames. The front door hung on one hinge. Inside, Seraphina could see a faint glow, like candlelight or flashlights. She heard voices, children's voices, and then she heard something that made her chest tighten. "Dad's here!" Seraphina moved closer, pressing herself against the concrete wall, peering through a crack in the boards. The sight that met her eyes shattered every assumption she'd made about Carter Hayes. He was kneeling on the filthy floor, surrounded by children, 4 of them ranging in age from maybe 6 to 12. He was dividing the food into equal portions, carefully cutting the bread, measuring the milk into mismatched cups. He wasn't rushing. He was talking to each child individually. A girl with tangled dark hair held up a scraped knee. Carter cleaned it with bottled water, applied antibiotic ointment, and wrapped it with a bandage from his backpack. "Matilda, you need to be more careful on those stairs," he said gently. The girl, Matilda, smiled. "I was trying to get the good blanket from the 3rd floor." An older boy, thin and wary, stood watch by a broken window. "Leo, come eat," Carter called. The boy, Leo, shook his head. "Someone needs to watch." Carter's voice was firm but kind. "I'm here now. You can rest." Leo hesitated, then walked over and sat down next to a younger boy who was already eating. Carter ruffled the younger boy's hair. "Oliver, slow down. There's enough." The smallest child, a boy who couldn't have been older than 6, crawled into Carter's lap. The little boy nodded, but Seraphina could see him trembling. Carter wrapped his jacket around Finn and held him close. "Bad dreams again?" Finn whispered something Seraphina couldn't hear. Carter's response was quiet, soothing. "I'm right here. You're safe." Seraphina couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The man she'd fired, the man she'd publicly humiliated, was acting as a father to children the world had abandoned. This wasn't charity. This wasn't a publicity stunt. This was a man who'd made these children his life. She stood there for 10 minutes, watching Carter teach Matilda how to read from a battered book. Watching him help Oliver with arithmetic, using pieces of cardboard as a makeshift whiteboard. Watching him check Finn's forehead for fever. Watching Leo reluctantly accept food while maintaining his protective stance. These children called him Dad, not because of biology, but because he was the only stability they'd ever known. Seraphina finally understood why Carter had needed to leave immediately, why he'd taken those 15-minute breaks, why he'd carried that backpack everywhere. He wasn't stealing from the company. He was stealing time to keep 4 children alive. Carter had been a safety engineer once. Seraphina didn't know this, but she would learn it later. He'd been good at his job, specializing in emergency response systems. 2 years ago, there'd been a fire at a temporary shelter across town. A child had died because the smoke detectors had been disabled to save money on battery replacements. Carter had been the engineer who'd signed off on the inspection report 3 months earlier. He'd done the inspection by the book, but he'd trusted the shelter manager when the manager said the detectors were functional. Carter hadn't physically tested each one. The guilt had destroyed him. He'd quit his engineering job, taken the factory work because it didn't require references, and started spending every spare moment checking on homeless encampments, looking for children, making sure they had what they needed to survive. The 4 kids in this building weren't the first he'd helped, but they were the ones who'd stayed, the ones who had nowhere else to go. Leo's parents were in prison. Matilda had aged out of foster care with no skills and no money. Oliver had run away from an abusive home. Finn had been abandoned at a hospital and slipped through the cracks of the system. Carter had created rules for the group. No stealing unless it was a matter of survival. No violence. Everyone shares. Everyone learns something every day. The children followed his rules because they understood that Carter was the difference between life and death. Seraphina backed away from the building, her hands shaking. She got into her car and sat there for 20 minutes, staring at nothing. Everything she believed about strength and discipline and business was collapsing. She'd fired a good man, maybe the only genuinely good man she'd ever met. And she'd done it because she'd been too afraid to question, too proud to listen, too convinced that trust was weakness. The next morning, Seraphina learned that the abandoned building was scheduled for demolition. The city had finally approved a redevelopment project for the entire block. Notices had been posted 48 hours earlier. The residents had 2 days to evacuate. The children had 2 days to find somewhere else to hide. When she looked at the development plans, Seraphina saw the contractor's logo and her stomach dropped. It was the same company that had been doing the shoddy maintenance work at Blake Dynamics. The same company Clinton Voss had been pushing contracts to. The redevelopment project was a partnership deal, and buried in the paperwork was Blake Dynamics' name, a minor investor providing equipment and materials. She'd signed off on it months ago without reading the details. Her company was helping to destroy the only home those children had. That night, Carter didn't return to the building. He stayed outside, watching as city workers posted the final notices. The children were terrified. Leo was trying to organize their few belongings, stuffing everything into plastic bags. Matilda was crying quietly. Oliver was pacing like a trapped animal. Finn wouldn't let go of Carter's leg. "They're going to split us up," Leo said, his voice cracking. "They're going to put us in different places." Carter knelt down, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "I won't let that happen." But they both knew he had no legal standing. He wasn't their guardian. He had no parental rights. If the authorities found these children, they'd be separated, processed through a system that had already failed them once. Seraphina arrived just after sunset. She stepped out of her car wearing an expensive coat and carrying an envelope. "I can help," she said. "I can pay for a hotel. I can—" Leo stepped in front of the younger children, his body language defensive. "We don't need your money." The hostility in his voice was sharp enough to cut. "You're the one who fired him. You're the reason everything's worse." Carter stood up, placing a hand on Leo's shoulder. "It's okay." He looked at Seraphina, and there was no anger in his expression. Just exhaustion. "You can't fix this with money, Miss Blake. These kids have been hurt by people who thought they knew better. People who made decisions without understanding. Money doesn't change that." Seraphina felt something crack inside her chest. "Then what do you want from me?" Carter's answer was simple and devastating. "I want you to see them, really see them, not as a problem to solve or a tax write-off. As people." While Seraphina was trying to understand the consequences of her own actions, Clinton Voss was moving to eliminate any loose ends. He'd started a whisper campaign at the factory, spreading the story that Carter had been stealing supplies and using them for some kind of illegal operation. When Vivian Cole, the PR director, showed up in Seraphina's office with printouts from the company's internal message boards, Seraphina saw how quickly the narrative had turned. Soft CEO lets criminal walk free. Blake protecting a thief. Wilfred Stone called within the hour. "This is exactly what I was worried about. You're making this company look weak." But Seraphina wasn't the same person she'd been 48 hours ago. She told Vivian to ignore the message boards. She told Wilfred she'd handle it, and then she did something she should have done from the beginning. She ordered a full audit of the sensor data from the night of Carter's termination. She wanted the raw logs, not the summary report Clinton had provided. Ingrid Walsh, the company's legal counsel, delivered the news in person. Someone edited the files. The original data shows multiple safety warnings that were deliberately silenced. Carter Hayes didn't sabotage anything. He prevented a catastrophic failure. Ingrid's expression was grim. If we'd kept running that line, we could have had an explosion. People could have died. And if this comes out, we're looking at regulatory investigations, lawsuits, criminal charges. Seraphina stared at the unedited logs. Every warning Carter had tried to report was there. Every safety violation Clinton had ignored. Who edited the files? Ingrid pulled up the access records. Clinton Voss. The anger that flooded through Seraphina was different from anything she'd felt before. It wasn't the cold fury of a CEO protecting her company's reputation. It was the hot rage of someone who'd been used as a weapon against an innocent man. She'd been manipulated. Clinton had fed her exactly the story she'd wanted to hear, the story that justified her worldview. Trust no one, show strength, cut the weak links. She called Clinton into her office. He walked in confident, expecting praise for handling the Carter Hayes situation so cleanly. Seraphina let him sit down before she asked the question. "Why did you edit the sensor logs?" She watched the color drain from his face, watched him calculate his options. He went with denial. "I don't know what you're talking about." Seraphina turned her laptop around so he could see the access records. "Explain this." Clinton's face hardened. "Fine. You want the truth?" Carter Hayes was a liability. He questioned every decision, slowed down production, cost us money. I did what you were too soft to do. I protected this company's interests. Seraphina's voice was ice. You falsified safety records. You put lives at risk, and you used me to cover it up. Clinton leaned forward. And what are you going to do about it? If you expose this, the whole company goes down. Stock price crashes, investigations, lawsuits. You'll lose everything. He smiled, and it was ugly. And I need you to back me up. We both walk away clean, but Seraphina had already made her decision. Get out, you're fired, and I'm turning the evidence over to the authorities. The confrontation with the board happened the same day. Seraphina walked into the meeting room with Ingrid beside her, carrying a folder of evidence. Wilfred Stone was already seated, along with 3 other board members. They looked impatient. This better be important, Seraphina. She laid out the evidence. The falsified reports, the safety violations, Clinton's scheme with the maintenance contractor, the board's financial exposure if any of this became public. We need to self-report to the regulatory agencies, she said. We need to implement immediate safety reforms. And we need to make this right. Wilfred's face turned red. If we do that, we're admitting liability. The lawsuits alone will sink us. The stock will tank. You'll be out within a week. The other board members nodded. They were already doing the math. Scandal, loss of investor confidence, possible criminal charges for the executives. Seraphina felt her hands tremble, but her voice stayed steady. Then fire me. But I'm not burying this. Wilfred stood up. You're making an emotional decision. This is about those homeless kids, isn't it? You're throwing away the company your father built for a man you fired and some street children. His voice dripped with contempt. This is exactly why women don't belong in leadership. You let sentiment cloud your judgment. For a moment, the old Seraphina wanted to cave, to protect herself, to stay silent. But then she thought about Carter kneeling in that ruined building, bandaging Matilda's knee, teaching Oliver arithmetic, holding Finn when the nightmares came. She thought about a man who'd sacrificed everything, including his reputation, to protect children who had nothing. "Fire me if you want," she said. "But I'm not selling my conscience to keep a title." The board voted. 3-2. Temporary suspension of executive authority pending a full investigation. Seraphina walked out of that boardroom knowing she might never walk back in as CEO. The media would crucify her. The investors would bail. Everything she'd built would collapse. But for the first time in years, she could breathe. She went to the abandoned building that night to tell Carter what she'd done. But when she arrived, she smelled smoke. Flames were already climbing the walls, orange and hungry, feeding on old wood and dry rot. People were screaming. She could hear the children inside. Carter was already there, running toward the fire. Seraphina grabbed his arm. "You can't go in there." He shook her off. "They're inside." He pulled his shirt over his mouth and disappeared into the smoke. Seraphina stood frozen for maybe 3 seconds before her brain caught up with her body. She dialed 911, screaming their location into the phone. Then she ran in after him. The heat was suffocating. The smoke burned her lungs. She could barely see through the thick black clouds. But she could hear Carter's voice, calm and commanding, using his safety training. "Leo, stay low." "Matilda, cover your mouth." He was moving through the building like he'd memorized the layout, guiding the children toward the emergency exit in the back. Seraphina found Matilda coughing near a collapsed beam. She grabbed the girl and pulled her toward the sound of Carter's voice. Oliver stumbled past, supporting Finn. Carter had Leo by the hand, dragging him through the smoke. They made it to the back exit just as part of the roof collapsed behind them. Outside, they collapsed on the pavement, gasping for air. Fire trucks were arriving, sirens wailing. Paramedics rushed forward with oxygen masks. Seraphina's expensive coat was ruined, covered in soot and ash. Her hands were burned. She didn't care. She was staring at Carter, who was holding Finn and counting heads to make sure everyone was out. Carter looked at her, his face streaked with ash, and said something she'd never forget. "You could have died in there." Seraphina's voice came out raw from the smoke. "I already killed you once with my decisions. I wasn't going to do it again." Archie Dunn, who'd followed Seraphina when she'd left the company in a panic, had caught something on his phone camera. People moving around the building before the fire started. He'd recorded them, thinking they were looters. But when he showed the footage to the fire marshal, the investigation turned from accident to arson. The people in the video worked for the development company, the same company Clinton had been funneling contracts to. The fire was meant to accelerate the demolition timeline, clear out the homeless population, and eliminate any evidence of corner cutting in the building's original condemnation. Clinton had one last card to play, and he'd played it viciously. The police arrested 3 people that night. 2 days later, they arrested Clinton. He fought all the way to the police car, screaming that Seraphina had destroyed the company, that she was protecting criminals, that the homeless kids were just trash that needed clearing out anyway. The media storm was immediate and brutal. Blake Dynamics stock dropped 18% in 24 hours. Investors demanded answers. Wilfred Stone called an emergency board meeting and moved to permanently remove Seraphina from the CEO position. The vote was scheduled for the following Monday, but something unexpected happened. Ingrid Walsh had been quietly compiling evidence. Documentation of every safety violation Clinton had covered up. Every falsified report, every bribe to inspectors. She released it to the regulatory agencies and the media simultaneously. The story stopped being about a CEO protecting homeless children. It became a story about corporate corruption, about a whistleblower CEO who'd risked everything to do the right thing. The board's vote to remove Seraphina failed. Wilfred Stone resigned 2 days later when his own financial ties to the development scheme came to light. The company's stock stabilized, and slowly, painfully, Blake Dynamics began the process of real reform. But Seraphina knew that fixing corporate corruption was only half the problem. Carter and the children still had no home. The temporary shelter the city had provided was exactly the kind of institutional nightmare Carter had been trying to protect them from. Leo was already getting into fights. Finn had stopped talking. The system was grinding them down exactly the way Carter had feared. Seraphina worked with Ingrid to create something different. Not a shelter, not charity. A legally structured residential program with transparent oversight, licensed social workers, and a focus on keeping families together however they defined family. It took 6 weeks to set up, 6 weeks of navigating bureaucracy, finding the right property, hiring the right staff. Carter was involved in every decision, making sure the program served the children's actual needs, not what administrators thought they needed. Blake Dynamics funded it, but at arm's length through a separate nonprofit foundation. Seraphina made sure the company's involvement was structured to prevent conflicts of interest. She put independent board members in charge. She wanted the program to survive, even if Blake Dynamics didn't. Carter didn't take a management position. He didn't want an office or a title. He took a job as the facility's safety coordinator and on-site mentor. He'd be there for the children, but he'd also make sure that what happened to him, that fire 2 years ago where a child had died because of neglected safety equipment, never happened again. On the day the center opened, Seraphina arrived without the corporate car, without the designer clothes she usually wore to public events. She came in jeans and a simple sweater, carrying bags of groceries and books the children had requested. Not because she wanted credit, because Carter had taught her that showing up was more important than showing off. Finn saw her first. The little boy who'd been so traumatized by the fire that he hadn't spoken in days came running across the common room and wrapped his arms around her legs. "Miss, Seraphina, are you staying for breakfast?" Seraphina looked at Carter. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, wearing an apron, helping Leo cook pancakes. Matilda was setting the table. Oliver was reading a book in the corner, actually relaxed for the first time since she'd met him. This wasn't a perfect ending. These children still had trauma to work through. The system that had failed them was still broken. But they had a chance now. They had stability. They had someone who saw them as people, not problems. Carter walked over, still holding a spatula, and he said the same thing he'd said that first night in the abandoned building, but now it meant something different. "Welcome home." Seraphina didn't say anything. She couldn't, because she realized Carter wasn't just talking about the children finding a home. He was talking about her. The CEO who'd built walls around her heart to protect herself from betrayal had finally found her way back to something she'd lost when her father died. Trust, connection, the understanding that real strength wasn't about building barriers. It was about building bridges. She'd been speechless twice. Once, when she'd seen Carter caring for children in that ruined building. And now, standing in this bright, clean space full of laughter and hope, she was speechless again. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she'd finally found something worth protecting that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or stock prices. Carter went back to the kitchen. Finn tugged on Seraphina's hand, leading her to the table. "You can sit next to me," he said. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Seraphina sat down at a table full of people and felt like she belonged.